Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. Today's the first of a two-parter on redistricting, and today is specifically about what goes into making new districts for elections. The current redistricting wars between the Democratic and Republican parties is shaping up to be one of, if not the most influential factors on how the 2026 elections and beyond turn out. American elections already struggle with competitiveness. A large majority of contests for Congress are very predictable as to which party will win, and the same goes for a lot of state-level races like governor and state legislature. Now, despite my usual reluctance to put forth my own opinions, I have said before many times that I think it's quite obvious that none of these recent attempts at redistricting have altruistic motives, despite partisan justifications from both sides. Most of it is obvious attempts at gerrymandering. But let's put feelings aside for a moment. With neither party backing down, it's led many people to ask how we can ensure fair elections in America for the future. Or better yet, is it even possible to do that? And there's a lot to cover on this subject, so it's going to be split into two episodes. And before we get to the actual possibility of whether or not we can ensure fair elections, it makes most sense to set the stage by talking about the history of gerrymandering and redistricting, how redistricting happens in the states, the criteria for making new districts, and what lessons the past holds for today. And in the next episode, we'll talk about proposals for fixing the redistricting process and whether we can ensure fair districts in elections. So first, let's get into the brief history of redistricting in Congress, because if you really wanted to, you could make a whole episode about this on its own. Because as bitter and awful as the redistricting wars going on are right now, attempts to unfairly sway Congress's elections before they even happen are not a new thing. In fact, it's basically been there since the ratification of the U.S. Constitution back in 1789. And Lee Drutman, who's a lecturer and a commentator and author, he's been talking a lot about these current redistricting wars, and he has a really good Substack article about the brief history of redistricting. And some of this content comes from that, and some of it comes from other places. But back in 1789, this kind of stuff was already happening because the U.S. Constitution left how states elect representatives to the states. Though Congress could overrule them, it didn't really. But it was part of the 10th Amendment's powers delegated to the states, because the 10th Amendment says any powers not expressly given to the U.S. Constitution belong to the states. And so, in some ways, it was kind of a free-for-all for all the states to dictate how to redraw their districts, because they also redraw the congressional districts. It is not the federal government that does that. It is the state governments that do that. So Federalists and Democratic Republicans alike tried plenty of different methods to screw each other out of seats, and sometimes went back and forth between them. They engaged in the very first instances, at least in this country's history, of cracking and packing, which are two common ways to try to gerrymander, or at least try to unfairly redistrict for elections. Cracking being you split up opposing electorates across enough elections so that their power is diminished and they can't really compete in any of these elections, or at least try to diffuse them enough so that their power is limited. Or you pack them all into one or a handful of districts. So yeah, you guarantee that they're going to win those districts, but the vast majority of districts still are yours for the taking. And so there were all sorts of ways that both parties tried to do that in their respective strongholds. And sometimes they went back and forth between at-large districts, which encompassed the whole state. And this is just for Congress, by the way. State legislatures, that just gets into a whole other can of worms. But at-large states, they encompass the whole state. So everybody in that state votes on those districts. Then they also tried districted elections. So instead of everybody in the state voting on that district, you can only vote on that district if you live in that district's boundaries. They tried mixes of at-large and districted elections. So some of the states, if the state had multiple seats, some of them might have been at-large, and then some of them might have been districted. And then they also tried at-large districts, but you needed to reside in specific districts. So if there might have been 3 districts overall, or 3 at-large seats, but they technically all had their own districts that each at-large member needed to reside in, but the whole state could still vote for them. And the very first instance of a gerrymander can be seen in Virginia's 5th congressional district back then. And that was when Patrick Henry, an anti-federalist, tried to basically rig the election against James Madison by trying to fit a whole bunch of anti-federalist sympathizers who would later become the Democratic Republican Party into that district to try to take down James Madison. Although James Madison still won anyway against another fellow future president, James Monroe. So it still worked out for both of those guys anyways. But he had to get creative and try to appeal to people across party lines. So sometimes gerrymandering leads to people getting creative. But the term gerrymandering didn't actually get coined until about 1812 when Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry tried to secure his party's seats by signing off on a snaking state Senate district. Now, how you pronounce this name, some people call it Gary, some people call it Jerry. I think gerrymandering sounds more reasonable, sounds better, but whatever the case may be, the term wasn't coined until about 1812. And then so from about 1842 to 1896, the single member district became the primary method of redistricting because the Whig Party, who eventually filled the vacuum left by the dissolution of the Federalist Party, they came into power and they mandated single member districts for Congress nationwide through the 1842 Apportionment Act to try to preserve the districts that they had swept back in the 1840 elections. And it was the only time in American history that the U.S. House actually shrunk, except technically the Civil War, because when South seceded, technically the U.S. House became smaller. But despite the Whigs' attempts to try to preserve their power, it didn't work because they would still lose the House, and some Democratic states had already refused to comply with this order to move to single-member districts in the U.S. House until they started to realize it actually might help them protect them in the 1846 midterms. So they eventually then decided, you know what, single-member districts aren't so bad. Single-member districts, in case you don't know, each district has one person, as opposed to multi-member districts where a single district can have 2, 3, or more people representing it. And so in the 1840s and 1850s, leading up to the Civil War, boundaries were redrawn repeatedly, but it became even more pronounced in the Reconstruction era following the Civil War up through 1896, and especially past the Reconstruction era. So right at the end of the 1870s through 1896. And that nearly 2-decade period was probably the most similar to today's redistricting wars. And from 1896 up until about the 1960s, you saw solid regional blocks solidified as Democrats took back their stranglehold on the South, and Republicans dominated in the North. 1896 was the election of William McKinley, a Republican, against Democrat William Jennings Bryan. And this election is actually very notable for many reasons, but one of the most notable reasons is that much of today's urban and rural divide can be traced back to that election, where a lot of the more urban industrial factions and voters supported William McKinley, while more rural voters away from the cities supported William Jennings Bryan. And so because of the firm hold that Democrats and Republicans had in their respective regions of the country, they often didn't feel the need to redraw their congressional maps. Why bother? the other party's not competing. So Democrats in the South don't have to worry about Republicans, and Republicans in the North don't have to worry about Democrats, generally speaking. But then in the 1960s, things changed considerably because, for one, you saw the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which led to dramatically increasing Black voter registration and participation. And you also saw the beginning of what is often called the Great Sorting Out that led to many longtime Democratic strongholds becoming increasingly Republican. A lot of the historical Republican areas becoming increasingly Democratic. And then in 1967, Congress passed the Uniform Congressional District Act, which reaffirmed that 1842 Apportionment Act that the Whigs had passed, which required single-member districts. It also codified equal population requirements, meaning districts had to be relatively equal in population. And it also prevented southern states from trying to switch back to at-large blocks in an attempt to try to dilute Black representation. And then after the 1990 census, the Justice Department used the 1982 amendments to the Voting Rights Act to push states to create new majority-minority districts. Majority-minority meaning a district is predominantly racial minorities. And this led to a surge in majority Black districts and Black members in Congress, but it also basically guaranteed that surrounding districts would be whiter and more Republican. And then you saw the 1994 midterms saw Republicans take back the U.S. House for the first time in 4 decades. And the great sorting out started to sort of reach its culmination with the South. You really started to see them becoming more Republican and more in the North starting to become more Democrat. And especially with Democrats increasingly moving into cities and suburbs, and then Republicans were increasingly moving into rural areas and exurbs. And you saw these, as there was this sorting out, you saw more and more competitive elections. But after 1994, those genuinely competitive districts started shrinking in frequency, as well as split ticket voting. And you can still see some of it today where these genuinely competitive districts are becoming fewer and fewer, and split ticket voting is becoming even less common than it was before. And so that leads us into today. How do states redistrict for federal, state, and local level? Because states are required to redraw their lines every 10 years following the census. You get a decade. And there are 3 basic ways that states redistrict legislative boundaries at the federal and state level. It can be led by the state legislature, it can be led by a commission, or it can be led jointly by state legislature and a commission. And how one state redistricts its federal boundaries, that is to say for the U.S. House, because the U.S. Senate covers entire states, so you don't actually redistrict those. But how one state redistricts its federal boundaries isn't always the same as how it does it for the state legislature. So you might have one state that uses the state legislature predominantly to redraw its state legislature, but then a commission for the Congress. And there's also the fact that in some cases, a state's population is too small to have more than one U.S. House representative, like Wyoming, for example. So only 44 states have to worry about how to redistrict congressional districts because there's only one there. In the case of congressional redistricting, 33 states have their state legislature lead in drawing the new district boundaries. 9 states use a commission, and then 2 states use that hybrid of both a state legislature and a commission. And then for state legislative redistricting, 34 states use the state legislature to draw the new boundaries. 14 states do that with a commission, and then 2 states do that with a hybrid of both state legislature and commission. Now, local level redistricting is where it gets very tricky and very murky. And this is talking about things like city councils and county commissions. So there's even more variation in how local level redistricting is done compared to the federal and state level, because there are 90,000 local governments in the U.S. think it's 90,837 or something like that. But there's over 90,000 of those. So there's a lot of different ways it happens. And all local redistricting must at least follow equal population rules and comply with the Voting Rights Act. Though with the recent ruling in the Louisiana versus Calais case, that may change that somewhat. And also, local areas are subject to some extent to state laws, and that depends on how much home rule is granted to those local areas. So in some states, they might give certain localities more power in how they redraw their city district lines or their county district lines compared to other states where they might say specifically, you have to do it this way. Typically, they redistrict after the census just like federal and state lines do, but they may not do so if they confirm that their populations are relatively unchanged and still have relatively equal population in the districts. So a lot of cities might not, or towns, they might not change all that much in their demographic makeup. They might have basically the same amount of population as they did the last time. But a lot of cities have been growing considerably, so they will have to redistrict. And how they exactly redistrict is a bunch of different ways that it can be. Some may use commissions, some may hire consultants to do it for them. Some may have the local legislative body draw it instead, or there might be a completely different way. And again, some states give their localities more leeway into how those local legislative boundaries are drawn than in other states. So it can be a whole bunch of different ways that it happens. But all that being said, there are certain criteria that generally have to be followed when it comes to redistricting. Though how important they have to be in the process varies depending on federal, state, and local laws. Because, again, the U.S. Constitution had very few stipulations for how to redraw Congress. It was mostly just that they have to reapportion based on population. So, the bigger the state is, the more U.S. House reps they have, generally speaking. But how those actual districts are redrawn, mostly up to the states. And then state constitutions can vary considerably on how to redistrict state and local governments because, again, most of those powers belong to them because of the 10th Amendment. But there are a handful or so of relevant factors that you typically see, regardless of what state you're talking about. And the most common criteria that you see are that districts have to have an equal population, they have to have racial minority representation or have to have it to some consideration, they have to be contiguous, they have to respect existing political boundaries like cities and counties, they have to be compact, they have to preserve communities of interest, and there has to be some consideration for undue partisanship or to prevent undue partisanship. Those are the 7 main criteria that you see. But not every state has to follow each one of those things. And even when they do follow each one of those things, what their definitions are or how important they have to be depends on the state. And looking up some of the statistics about which states consider which factors, there's a bit of a discrepancy in how many states use each criterion between the Congressional Research Service and All About Redistricting. And All About Redistricting is hosted by the Loyola Law School of Loyola Marymount University. But since All About Redistricting gives numbers of states using these criteria for Congress and state legislatures, I went with their numbers whenever possible. But generally speaking, there's not a whole lot of difference between those two sources. So first, equal population. And this can look a little bit different for the U.S. House and state and local districts, but generally speaking, your districts have to be relatively equal. It's almost impossible to make them exactly equal, but they have to be pretty close to being equal. And there are some mathematical calculations for that, depending on the state. For the U.S. House, reapportionment, not redistricting, decides how to reallocate the 435 seats in the U.S. House across the states based on their populations. But after you get to that point, once those seats are reapportioned, now to get to the actual redistricting, calculations are based on the total number of people in each state, not the number of voters or eligible voters that are in that state. So even children and babies and people who are not eligible to vote but are still adults, they are all counted. And states must make a good faith effort to draw districts with about the same number of people in each district. And so it has to be consistent and relatively small of a spread. And if you do that, it's likely going to be found to be constitutional, at least on the equal population grounds. Now, for state and local districts, when it comes to equal population, there's more flexibility than the federal level, but they still must be, quote unquote, substantially equal. Legal rulings have mostly stated that it's probably not constitutional if the largest state legislative district and the smallest state legislative district are more than 10% apart, unless there's a very compelling reason for that. And also, a smaller disparity can also be struck down if it's not justified. And some states are more strict legally on population equality limits than other states might be, especially Colorado, Missouri, and Iowa. But who is counted can be a bit murkier, because the Supreme Court has not been definitive on this when it comes to the state legislatures and local legislative bodies. Now, for the U.S. House, yes, everybody in the population is counted. But at the state and local levels, some pundits and states and politicians have suggested using voting age population, so anybody that's 18 or older, or citizen voting age population, so anybody who's 18 or older and is also a citizen of the United States. Or they've considered using registered voters rather than total population. So whenever it comes to the state level, it tends to get murkier and murkier because there's 50 different states. The second criterion that is predominantly considered when it comes to redistricting is racial minority representation. For the most part, their legal protections include preventing lines being drawn that deliberately set out to harm voters based on race, particularly black voters, and where discrimination currently or has historically played a significant role. So you look at electoral patterns to decide whether minorities have proportionate electoral power. Now, the recent ruling in Louisiana versus Calais has changed some things in that regard, because now there can no longer be a district drawn specifically to have a majority minority district, that is to say, predominantly voters of color. The idea there being, and this is not necessarily, obviously it's not entirely agreed upon, but the idea behind these districts is that if you have one or two of these districts where they're majority minority districts, you can guarantee that there's going to be some black representation in Congress. As opposed to if you spread them out, it becomes less and less likely, because historically, blacks have been underrepresented in Congress. Now, this ruling by Louisiana versus Calais is typically hailed by conservatives as not deliberately benefiting any race by specifically drawing districts to favor them. And it's also typically lamented by liberals because there are likely to be fewer people of color elected to Congress and state legislatures now. There's also the consideration that black voters predominantly vote Democratic, so that also sways some people's opinions based on whether or not they're Republican or Democrat. The third criterion that is most often considered when you redistrict is contiguity. And contiguity means the entirety of the district must be physically connected. Like when you talk about the contiguous United States, you talk about the main 48. Alaska and Hawaii are separated from the U.S., so they are not considered contiguous. And it's, for a lot of states, it's a similar case for their districts, whether it's congressional or state legislative. 45 states require at least one chamber's state legislative districts to be contiguous. So they might require for a state house, they might require it for a state senate, and then, of course, some states will require it for both chambers. Now, in practice, the contiguous stipulations don't always work out, or they're at least given some legal exceptions, like how some districts may be split by bodies of water in coastal states like Florida or North Carolina. They could be, in these cases, they could be considered contiguous if a common means of transport connects the sections. So if there is like a ferry that typically goes between the two sides, that can be considered contiguous. Or if there's an island section and a mainland section, if the island section is closest to that mainland section, that part of the island will be considered part of that district that the mainland area is, as long as they're pretty close together. And there's also another exception that is somewhat common that you see, where a city may have a non-contiguous portion away from the rest of the city. And so in an attempt to preserve that city's representation the way it is in the state legislature, they may have all of that city incorporated within one legislative district. So those are the two common exceptions you see when it comes to contiguity. Common criterion number 4 for redistricting is the preservation of political boundaries that already exist. So things like counties and cities and towns and ward lines. The idea is to try to not split these up across state legislative districts as much as you can. So try to, whenever possible, keep the entire county within the same state legislative district. Now, obviously, it doesn't always work out like that because of population issues, for example, or population considerations. But in any case, 34 states require state legislative districts to show some accounting for political boundaries, and then 15 states do it for congressional districts. And because congressional districts are inherently bigger than those state legislative districts, sometimes the considerations are a little bit different. And usually, state law simply just says to keep the political boundaries, quote, to the extent practicable, end quote. So it's sometimes very vague as to what they stipulate when it comes to political boundaries, kind of like how it's vague for some of these other stipulations. And so this can be complicated for cities or towns that spill over county lines. So if county or, I'm trying to think of a specific city. You know how Kansas City is, it's split over state lines. But if you were to take the situation of Kansas City and apply it to another city that's, instead of over state boundaries, it's over county boundaries. It's split up between two counties. That legislative district may instead just keep that entire city within the legislative district, even though it goes across multiple counties. And if counties or cities have to be split to comply with other redistricting requirements, like equal population, most state law does not specify if the number of splits must be minimized. So it doesn't say specifically if you're going to have to split these counties or cities across multiple legislative districts, you can only do it 2 times. You can only do it 3 times. A lot of times it doesn't have that. It just simply says to keep the political boundaries to the extent practicable. The 5th major criterion that you typically see for redistricting is compactness. So if you look how many states split counties and state legislative districts, you will notice that sometimes areas are relatively squared off, or at least they don't spread out incredibly far. They don't have tendrils going out everywhere. If you watched my episode with Stephanie Houghton, it was actually my random question of the day with her. We talked about the most pleasing looking county boundaries, and we looked at a lot of the states, especially in the Midwest. A lot of them look very much squared off, whereas other states outside of the Midwest, a lot of them do not do that. So people in the district live relatively close to each other when it comes to compact legislative districts. And 32 states require compact state legislative districts, while 17 states require compactness for congressional districts. But what compactness means is often vague. Few states actually precisely define it. Scholars have actually proposed over 30 different measures for it. And these generally fall into 3 categories. You have contorted boundaries, So the idea is smoother boundaries means it's more compact. So if it's very squared or rectangled, it's probably going to look more compact. But if it's got a lot of squiggles and many different sides, it's probably not going to be considered compact. Then there's also the level of dispersion. So districts that only spread out a little from a central core are considered more compact. And then the third basic category that you have to see is the consideration of housing patterns. So if district tendrils spread out based on whether the area is sparsely or densely populated. And this is more meaningful in dense areas because if they're more densely populated, it is easier to make districts more compact based on housing patterns, whereas if they're a lot more spread out, like in rural areas, it becomes a lot more difficult to make them compact. So the consideration of district tendrils and spreading out all over the place isn't as big of a deal because it's going to happen when the place is sparsely populated. The sixth major criterion for redistricting is the preservation of communities of interest. And these are groups of people with a common interest, usually one that legislation might benefit. And so such interest can be incredibly varied. It might be a very social one, it might be a cultural one, historical, racial, ethnic, partisan, economic. Take your pick. It could be a whole bunch of different kinds of interests that are considered here. And sometimes these interests will be naturally preserved by following other criteria such as compactness or observing political subdivisions. And 15 states consider keeping communities of interest whole for state legislative districts, and 11 states do so for congressional districts. The last major criterion for redistricting that a lot of states use is the consideration of partisan outcomes. So how much is a map designed to favor either Republicans or Democrats? Now, the U.S. Constitution has had few, if any, practical limits in this regard, especially because at that point, the Founding Fathers weren't necessarily thinking about political parties, even if they, as we talked about a couple episodes ago, even if they fairly quickly took to political parties once they were forming. At the time of the U.S. Constitution, they weren't necessarily thinking about those. So the U.S. Constitution said nothing about parties. And the Supreme Court of the United States has been ambivalent about this issue too. On one hand, it said that excessive partisanship in the process is unconstitutional. But it's also said that federal courts cannot hear claims of undue partisanship because of an inability to decide when there is too much partisanship. So basically, they say they cannot be the arbiters of when there is too much partisanship. It can become a political question that then if they rule one way or another, it might also look like they're favoring one party or another. So they've and those two rulings weren't around the same exact time, but the Supreme Court has kind of hemmed and hawed a little bit about what to do about partisan gerrymandering. State laws, however, have often taken to restricting undue partisanship. 19 states do this for state legislative districts, and 17 of them do it for Congress, though how exactly they do that differs. They might explicitly encourage competitive districts, or they might prohibit discouraging of competition. Now, how enforceable those are, we'll have to see, especially with states, both Republican and Democrat, clearly trying to partisanly draw favorable maps for their own respective party in power. But there are some states that at least say that you cannot draw maps that lead to undue partisanship. And those are the main criteria. Those are the most common criteria that you see in states. But there are some other ones that you might see as well. Things like nesting. So nesting refers to when district boundaries of state Senate districts roughly or completely encompass the same boundaries as 2 to 3 state House districts. Washington, for example, their state Senate districts are basically the exact same boundaries as, I believe they have 2 House districts within each state Senate district. And there are several states that do that, or at least come close to doing that. In fact, 18 states ask for nesting whenever it is possible, though in a few cases it's more of a rough preference rather than a mandate. So it's like, we'd really like you to nest these districts if you can, but we're not going to make you do it, is basically what the state law says in a lot of those places. There's also relatively few, but there are some states that use multi-member districts for at least one of their state legislative chambers. So their districts elect more than one person to represent them. And 9 states use this for their state houses, and 2 use it for their state senates. And Vermont is the only state that does it for both chambers. And then you lastly have what are called floterial districts, which means that a district wholly or partially overlaps other districts in the same chamber, as opposed to where you talk about nesting, where state senate lines overlap a couple of state house districts. This is actually saying in floterial districts that maybe 2 state house districts can sort of overlap each other. And that's meant to preserve political boundaries while also limiting significant population disparities, especially if it's a city that is particularly large in that state compared to the rest of the population. And Florida, Mississippi, and New Hampshire in particular expressly permit floterial districts. So, when we take the past and apply it to today, what do we learn? What are the lessons of the past for today's redistricting wars? Well, for one thing, highly partisan redistricting has been around for a long time, and the process of making new districts has never, ever been 100% fair across the board. Now, there might be some places where they actually legitimately did try to be fair, but for every state, that's never been the case. But there have been eras where it has been fairer than others. And before these recent attempts by the 2 major parties to redistrict, it still wasn't completely fair, because you have sometimes seen maps where they have had to be redrawn after being struck down by courts. Florida, it happened back in, I believe it was 2014, 2016. North Carolina's had it. Arizona's had issues before. I don't know if I could say every single state has had an issue with it before, but probably more common than you think before today's recent stint of redistricting. But these past couple years have arguably been the most bald-faced and widespread attempts to unfairly district in some time. Still, though, even though we've had all these issues with redistricting in the past, we've still been able to overcome these obstacles, and the makeup of political bodies has still managed to change over time. Because another lesson we can take is that gerrymandering has still had notable instances where it completely backfired. We talked about Patrick Henry and Anti-Federalists who tried to screw James Madison out of an election, and it did not work out. James Madison won that election. The Whigs in 1842 trying to force single-member districts to preserve their gains. That didn't work. There's a lot of instances in state governments where the ruling party tried to find every way to preserve its power, and it did not work. In my state, Florida, for example, the state legislature once had a group that was dubbed the Pork Chop Gang, which was a group of Northern Democratic legislators who tried to basically fix, maybe not quite fix elections, but they tried to gerrymander districts so that they could constantly get reelected and keep their, not just Democratic power, but their power specifically for their specific faction of Democrats. And now, and that was a while ago. That was back in like the 60s and maybe into the 70s. Now, Florida's one of the most Republican state legislatures there is, but that's a case where a party has completely changed despite one party completely dominating it. Or how Democrats used to rule the South and Republicans used to rule the North. And despite their attempts to hold on to power, even though at some points they were so dominant they didn't really have to worry about redistricting, they actually went for long spurts of time during that first half of the 20th century, where sometimes they didn't even bother to redistrict because they didn't need to. At least they didn't need to keep their power. But eventually, those strongholds went to the wayside, and they kind of traded places as to where their strength was. So as much as gerrymandering has tried to basically rig elections, it hasn't always worked the way it was expected to, meaning voters can still affect some change. They can still tell their legislators that these things are not okay, that they want something new. And redistricting methods have also changed a lot over time, even if they've swung back and forth between different methods, like early on where it was at-large to districted to a mix of at-large and districted to at-large, but you have to live in a specific district, and going back and forth between all those different kinds of districting methods. So change is possible, but is it time for something wholly new? Could something wholly new happen, like perhaps proportional representation, which we'll talk about in the next episode? Will enough people get tired of the redistricting wars from both parties that it spurs widespread grassroots change in redistricting methods? Perhaps many more states adopt independent commissions instead of having their state legislatures run the show. Obviously, time will tell on that, but that'll also take a lot of other people, a lot of normally partisan people saying that they've had enough of their own party's partisanship and being willing to fight for something better, fight for something more fair. All things said, despite all of these attempts to try to, if not outright rig elections, to at least unfairly sway elections, history shows that we don't have to just accept that this is the way things are from now on, that things can change. And sometimes you have to incentivize the powers that be, regardless of whether they're Republican or Democrat, to actually affect that change. Sometimes it has to be the people themselves that affect that change. But all these historical bullet points that I demonstrated and all of these different ways that states handle how they redistrict, it shows that we can make things better, that we can actually make elections more fair. But we have to demand it. We have to make it happen, because clearly politicians are not going to do it of their own accord. It's going to have to be us that make them do it, which is going to be a core part of the next episode, where I talk about whether we can ensure fair districts in elections and what we have to consider when we talk about a fair district. Because what somebody else thinks is a fair district, we might not think is fair, or we might think something is fair and somebody else doesn't. Some attempts to gerrymander elections are pretty obvious, but some aren't. And we're going to talk about what a lot of those considerations we need to think about are in regards to that. But that is going to do it for today's episode of the Politics with Paul podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. Please like, comment, share, subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. My links in the show notes, my LinkedIn I post on very frequently, my medium.com profile, my Facebook page, my website, email, my 5-day educational email course about how we can more effectively mitigate toxicity and polarization in American politics, and my book on Amazon. And that's going to wrap things up here. So, as always, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.